Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can also see you. Can you hear and see us?
That's great. I'll move that a little. Yep, I can see you and I can hear you.
Wonderful. Great. So, Kitty Stewart, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. You are Associate Professor at London School of Economics. My name is Mallory. I'm Secretary for this Commission on Early Childhood Education in Quebec. The Commission's mandate is to assess the situation of early childhood education services in the province and to make recommendations in terms of public policy, to forge our collective vision for the future. And the people that are holding this mandate very hard and responsible for it are the Commission members, which I will introduce you to. André Lebon, Chair, sitting by my side, Martine Desjardins, and Pierre Landry. So as a reminder, the activity today, the public hearing with experts, objective is to inform the Commission members of the most recent and complete research results, also to provide them with a broad perspective. That's why we also called for contributions outside of Montreal. So you are the 14th person that we hear. We've been hearing 10 people yesterday that came and that were mostly from Quebec, and you are the 4th person that we hear today that are from outside of Quebec. So so this is how it's going to work. You have a 15 minutes presentation, and it will be followed by questions from the Commission members. If we have time, if they don't use up the entire time, we will go to the audience and allow them to also ask you questions. You won't be able to see them, but you will hear them properly. And I also want to remind you that this presentation is recorded, and people are hearing from the comfort of their homes live what we're doing here in this classroom. So if the technology fails us, we will call you back. First, we'll try on Skype, and if for some reason it's not working properly, over the phone.
Okay.
That's fine?
That's great. I have one, because I have a presentation.
Yes.
But I haven't, I don't know if you have that in front of you, or because I was trying to do a split screen so you could see that, but I can't work out how to do that.
Okay, so I'll try to walk you through how to do it, but if it doesn't work, we do have your presentation here on our computers, the Commission members. Only the audience won't be able to see it, so it's best if we can manage to see your presentation. So on the bottom of your screen, you have a little plus sign. If you, on the Skype program, if you don't see the plus sign.
Oh, I see it.
So it's if you click on that, it gives you the option of sharing screen.
Yep.
And that's how it should be working.
So then if I say slideshow, you should be able to see that?
Yeah. So we can try.
Start.
It's working perfectly.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. That's great.
Yeah. So go ahead. We're listening to you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. Do put your hand up if I'm not coming across clearly, and I'll try and notice that and stop. I thought what I'd do is just give a very brief summary of the situation regarding early childhood education and care in England, and then at the end think about what our current challenges are for us and perhaps what lessons might be for you. So to begin with, I just wanted to highlight that there are really, I would say, 4 elements to the way that we've looked at provision for young children over the last 15, 20 years, during which early childhood has really become very much more important on the agenda than it was before. And I know we won't be focusing on all of these, but I thought it's certainly at its best, at the best of the provision over the last 20 years. We've been thinking about all 4 of these things. So the first one is I think, represented by our Sure Start Children's Centres, so which are centres that provide integrated provision for all children under 5 and their families. So the idea is you go there when you're pregnant and continue going when you're breastfeeding. You take your child there for a drop-in. There's parenting classes and so on. And then many of those also had childcare attached to them. So that was a very important part of provision, a sort of multiple service integrated centre for all young children. That's really been rolled back over the last few years, but I think it was working very well as a model. So I think that was an important part of our provision. The second is a focus on early education primarily through a universal preschool offer. So all 3 and 4-year-olds have the entitlement to 15 hours of free early education. That's been the case for the last 15 years. And that is actually has been provided in a very fragmented way, in fact, through many different types of providers, which has its problems and challenges. And they have different qualification requirements, for example, so different levels of quality. However, we do have an early years foundation stage curriculum which applies to all of those different settings and tries to ensure that they provide even though children are going to different places, in principle they should be accessing the same curriculum, and it's quite a popular, very play-based curriculum. So I think that is one of the strengths of our system. And we now have a targeted offer as well for more disadvantaged 2-year-olds. The third element is some support for childcare for working parents, and that has been very targeted on lower income families. More recently, our government has started to think more about support for middle and higher income families. So we have a new tax-free childcare scheme which should be coming into play, which will basically provide 20%. The government will top up families' spending on childcare by 20%. They'll give them 20% towards their childcare spending. And most recently, we have a promise to extend those 15 free hours for 3 and 4-year-olds to 25 hours for working parents. So that will benefit all working parents, including those on much higher incomes. And the fourth element I want to highlight is financial support for families with young children, just because I think that has been a very important part of the picture in the UK. That was seen providing more generous benefits, family allowances for families with young children under the Labour government was a very important part of the story. So it was about both services and income. That's been, again, really rolled back in recent years. But I think that that provides a more kind of holistic picture of what we need to be doing for young children. Okay, so what effect did that have? Just very briefly, you can see there on this figure that we dramatically really increased the level of spending on young children. So that first set of bars is the money largely going into those early education places, the universal free offer, very expensive. A bit less going into Sure Start, and you can see there the third bar is the childcare, the targeted childcare support, and then employer vouchers, which are more going to higher income parents. So a big investment in this area. What effect did it have? We have a substantial increase in the number of childcare places. You can see that green line, the number of full daycare places going right up, and replacing a lot of more sessional part-time places. So more and more people moving into full day care, partly because of subsidy. This shows us, I guess, the extent to which support for childcare has been targeted. So we often think of ourselves in the UK as a very high cost childcare nation. Childcare is expensive beyond those free 15 hours. And that is certainly true for higher and middle income families. As you can see, the UK is the green bar there. So as a share of income, higher income families in the UK are paying much, much more than they're paying in the OECD on average. However, if you're a lone parent, and particularly a low-income lone parent, and to an extent, if you're also a low-income couple, the amount that you're having to spend is much, much lower. So that childcare support was very targeted towards those families. We've seen a big increase in the take-up of formal childcare, and particularly for 3 and 4-year-olds, where this shows us different age groups. And here on this next figure, we can see this is just the 3-year-olds actually, and you can see that line at the top is more or less now universal coverage for 3 and 4-year-olds children accessing early education. What this shows us also is interesting if you are able to read some of those other bars. So PVI are the private, voluntary and independent sectors. And we have a division in Britain really between this early education that's provided in state nursery schools and state nursery classes attached to primary schools. So as a sort of extra year or two on the front end of primary school. About a third of children, as you can see from that, a third of 3-year-olds. Oh, I think you've lost my picture. No, this might be back. A third of 3-year-olds are in these state nursery schools and classes. And more children are in private, voluntary and independent sectors. So that might include private, for-profit day nurseries, voluntary part-time preschools. And I think you can see there that what's happened is all of the increase that took place around 2000 when the promise of a free offer for all 3 and 4-year-olds came in, all of that increase was taken up by the private, voluntary and independent sectors. So we had no expansion of the nursery schools and classes. And you can also see there that actually the increase overall wasn't that great. I think you can see that actually more than 80% of children were already attending something, but they weren't being funded. So the big increase, that dotted line, shows us the big increase in the share of 3-year-olds that now received a funded place. So that huge level of increase in spending we saw at the beginning, a lot of that went to provide funding for places that children were already taking up. So it was effectively a subsidy to parents. They would see that a parent who was using a nursery, a private nursery, would have experienced that as a reduction in their fees because 15 of those hours are now free. So the policy was very effective at reaching all 3-year-olds, but it did so at quite high cost by funding a lot of places that were already taking place. Of course, you can see that as a subsidy to higher income parents, so that might be part of important given the high costs of childcare for high income parents in Britain otherwise. Now, increasingly, there was a focus on quality. I think initially, under the Labour government, which first started thinking about that, they thought primarily about getting children into nursery classes and about expanding the number of childcare places. And then they started to think about the quality and how important the quality was. And the introduction of the early years foundation stage curriculum, which I referred to, was an important part of that. They also started to put funding into allowing settings to take on more qualified staff. And this figure here shows us that you can see at the top there that about a third of the staff who are in nursery schools and primary schools with nursery classes, so those are the state sector settings, about a third of the staff there have a degree, so they are qualified teachers. And that's because those settings have a requirement that there must be a teacher in the class. So those tend to be the highest quality settings. You can see much lower levels of graduate staff in our other settings. So there's a big divide there, which has to an extent been narrowed by the provision of targeted funding to support other types of setting to be able to train and then help them with the costs of taking on a more qualified staff. So we're improving, but it's a slow improvement, as you can see, even 2013. There's still quite a gap there. And I would say that there's a strong feeling here, evidence-based, based on evidence from studies that have been done in Britain, as well as wider evidence, that having more qualified staff is really important to the quality of provision. So certainly among academics working on this and among people working in the sector, there's a strong feeling that we really need to move more sharply to having more graduates. And I've just referred there to some studies that have evidenced that using robust evaluations. Now, I wanted to show you this, which is, I think, one very positive feature of our system, as I've showed you that only about a third of the children are going to these higher quality settings, which have a qualified teacher. Some of the other settings do, but not all of them. And what this shows us is that actually it turns out that more disadvantaged children are much more likely to access those places. So this shows us from 1 on the left is the least deprived areas, and 10 is the most deprived areas. And the green and the yellow bars and the blue bars together show us the percentage of children who are accessing a setting where they have access to a graduate. And it's much more likely in the most disadvantaged areas. That turns out to be simply because state nursery schools and classes are predominantly located in those areas. So almost by chance, we've sort of stumbled upon a way to make sure, very unusually in social policy, I think, that the most disadvantaged children are actually getting access to the highest quality provision. Key challenges. I wrote this slide actually last year, and so I thought it was interesting to look back on it because we've now got a new government which is addressing some of these challenges. And I would say the key challenges for us last year were that affordability remained a really big issue for middle and higher income parents. Apart from those free hours for 3- and 4-year-olds, provision of childcare for younger children very, very expensive. And for the additional hours, very expensive. The quality of provision remains an issue, particularly in parts of the private, voluntary and independent sector. So as I've said, our disadvantaged 3-year-olds are relatively protected by where they live and the setting that they attend, but not all live in the most disadvantaged areas. And when they extended this policy for 2-year-olds, the most disadvantaged 2-year-olds, which was also an early education targeted policy, that all of those places were provided in private, voluntary and independent settings. And many of them not high quality. So you can see there that a quarter of them got a very bad rating from our education regulation inspector, and half of them had no contact with a graduate. And that's despite evidence that these places really only make a difference if there is a graduate there. We know that from the pilot. Thirdly, I would say that there's kind of, although there was a bit of this distinction between the state-maintained sector, which largely provided part-time places, and then private day nurseries providing full-time places, was leading to a little bit of a divide in terms of where children were going. So you would get more working families in the private, voluntary and independent sector, and you would get more non-working families going to the state sector. So that was good in terms of the quality provision. It wasn't necessarily good in terms of social mix of children, and it also wasn't very good in terms of helping these places to act as childcare as well. So instead of your child starting at 3 and you thinking, okay, now I may be able to look for a job and extend the hours, because the place is very part-time, it meant that actually you'd probably postpone looking for a job until they were 5 and got a full-time place, because it would just complicate your life to get a job from a part-time nursery place. The government is currently responding to a couple of those things. They're putting much more investment into helping working parents with childcare costs, and I've talked about a couple of schemes. I'm very concerned that they have much less interest in quality than previous governments. So I think we're switching. If we started by thinking about affordability and availability of places and affordability for low-income parents, then we started thinking about quality. Now we're moving back to thinking about affordability, particularly for higher-income parents, and I think we're moving away from quality, and I have real concern about a couple of our policies in particular, which I won't go into now because I know we're short of time. Lessons for Quebec. I mean, I don't want to draw, I don't know your system very well, but I thought, firstly, a couple of general points. One comes out of just what I was just saying, which is the importance of keeping an eye on quality and the provision for the most disadvantaged children, while also worrying about the cost of provision and affordability for working families. I think maybe it's inevitable that governments seem to sort of slip between those two things and find it very difficult to make sure that they're thinking holistically about the impact of one on the other and how to achieve both. And of course, in terms of funding, you have to make choices, so maybe it's inevitable you choose one, not the other. Second general point, I would say, from our government, and there are bigger examples of this, as no doubt you've noticed with our Brexit referendum, making rash promises to the electorate about things you're going to do without thinking it through. So I think that's come out. One of the policies is of providing the 25 hours for working parents was something that the Conservatives just said they would do because they thought it sounded nice, I think, and now they're really struggling. And so they're having to raid the budget of our higher quality provision for disadvantaged children in order to find the funds to do that. And so that's something I'm really concerned about at the moment. Learning from the strengths of our system, I would say that the free universal offer is very effective at reaching everybody. And it's really convinced me that though it's expensive, having a universal offer that's free is really a good way of making sure you have high coverage. Secondly, I think it's very important to have dedicated funding mechanisms for quality. This is something I've done a bit of work on. And we had something called the Graduate Leader Fund, now abolished. But you can't just assume quality will get better. It doesn't just get bid up in a system. You either need to regulate or you need to provide the funding that gives settings the incentive and the ability to invest in higher quality. They're not able to do it if they don't have the funds. And thirdly, I would say our early years foundation stage curriculum is a positive thing. In terms of the weaknesses, I think we do have a very fragmented system, and that's developed over the last 20 years. I think perhaps it was a mistake to expand so rapidly the private and profit-making sector, allow those settings to provide places. And we provide a lot of funding goes to those providers now, both through supply-side mechanisms, through the free places for 3- and 4-year-olds, and through demand-side mechanisms such as our working tax credits. And I'm concerned that we don't attach sufficient conditions to that money. So I would advise governments, especially if they're thinking of putting more money in, always to think about the strings that you want to attach to that. I think that's it from me. There's just some references.
Thank you very much, Kitty, for your presentation. I will now turn to the Commission members so they can ask their questions.
Thank you very much to share with us your observation. I have a question. It's not in your slide, and maybe you have or you don't have the answer. Here we have made an economic study about by having a system of childcare that brings back to the workforce many women. And finally, when they study about the cost and what it gives us in return, we see that it's a positive return. Did you make that kind of study in your system of how much it costs and how much it's bring you back?
Yes, so there is a study that's looked at the 3- and 4-year-old places in particular, because that's a universal policy that reached lots and lots of people. They find, interestingly, it had a small effect. They were disappointed with the extent of the maternal employment effect. I was surprised that they found an effect at all, because I think that the design of that policy is not well suited to encourage women's labour force participation, because it's 3 hours a day. It's not very helpful, really, for getting people back to work. In terms of the childcare tax, the childcare tax credits, I haven't seen such a study done for the UK, but I think I've seen the reports for Quebec, and I think that's right. It seems to me very likely that if we designed a policy that was effective at encouraging women into the labour market, it would have positive effects.
Thank you.
So I can send you the reference to that other paper. I'm not sure they did a cost-benefit analysis, actually, which is interesting. But I'm fairly sure there have been such studies, certainly simulations done, which make the same point, that that you get this money back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I actually have a few questions. I will ask you maybe just one and pass on the microphone and then came back. But still, you talk about a program that were installed for the 3- and 4-year-olds. Is that right? There is a program, unified program. Is the program apply in a for all, or is it adapted for high-risk children or some children, or is it the same for all the childcare system in UK actually?
It's the same for all, so it's unified.
Okay.
They should access, I mean, they access, as I said, different places, and some of them are more likely to be in some settings than others, but they all, the early years foundation stage curriculum applies to all of them, so they should all be doing the same sorts of things, and they have the same goals. We do have an increasing focus on narrowing gaps and on making sure that these work to get children to be ready for school. So they now have really they have a bit more funding. Children who are from disadvantaged backgrounds have a bit more funding attached to them in a system which really reflects what's going on later in school as well. Later in school, there's a lot of emphasis on schools have to show that they are narrowing that gap, and they have to show that they're spending that extra money on the children that they're supposed to spend it on, and whether it's having an effect. There's less of that been done so far at preschool, but we're certainly moving in that direction.
When you're talking about many different providers, are you talking about your universal system for 3 to 4, or you're talking about some kind of services you offer before 3 years old?
So I'm talking about both, really, because childcare really, from about 6 months, you can find nurseries that will take your child. So, and those nurseries are usually run from 6 months or even a little bit earlier, up to 5 years when children start full-time school. And there's a big range of providers filling that space, many private for-profit ones, also some local authority ones, some voluntary sector nurseries. The 3 and 4-year-old places, as I've said, a third of them go off to the states, they're in state schools, but the 2/3 remaining are in those same settings. So they'll be taking their place up in a setting which is for 0 to 5-year-olds. They'll be in the what's called the preschool room. So they'll be in a different room with 3 and 4-year-olds, but they're part of a unified setting. So I think the idea behind this was to provide choice for parents. So they wanted everybody to have a place. They wanted it to be universal, but they wanted, if parents had their child in a day nursery from the age of 0 or 1, they didn't want them to have to pull them out and put them somewhere else. They wanted for them to be able to stay there. So that's why they would stay there and get that place as a sort of reduction on their fees for those hours.
And one other question, is it the early years curriculum is applying also to -3 years old, or only for 3 and 4 years old?
No, it's for 0 to 5. It's 0 to 5. I mean, so when they introduced it, you can imagine lots of nursery workers protested, and we had reports in the papers about the nappy curriculum and how they were going to be making 1-year-olds, write their names and stuff. But it's it's not really like that. It's play based, and it's thinking about, it's developmentally appropriate. The sorts of activities you should be doing with a 1-year-old.
Yes, it's adapted to the age.
Yeah, that's right.
So
but
it's not a scholarship approach.
No.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to make sure I understand correctly how it works. From my perspective, what I understand is that you have a universal funding for 3 and 4 years old, which is actually benefits the parents for 25 hours a week. And for free, yes.
So for
25 hours a week?
15 hours a week is universal.
Okay. I thought it had been bumped up to 25, so that's why. So now go ahead.
So the government decided to increase it to 25 hours for working parents.
Only for working parents?
Yes.
Okay.
So only for working parents.
Okay.
So you have to be working, you have to be, in fact, it's a strange way of doing it. You have to be earning at least the minimum wage for 25 hours or something. So if you're on higher earnings, you actually have to work less. You could probably work a handful of hours, and as long as you meet that earnings requirement.
So if I understand correctly, you're not really at the universal funding type of a system because it's very, as you mentioned, it's very fragmented, and you are doing some targeted funding for low-income children to try to give them a better chance, I guess, and that you're focusing the money that you have on lower-income children. But do you think that that way of doing things gives the possibility of, because we know that there are vulnerable children within even mid-class or higher income families as well. How do you get to these children, actually? That would be my question.
Right. So I think the way the system was designed was that we have our Sure Start Children's Centres, which are universal. So the idea is that everybody can come into those. So if you pick up a family who's in need of extra support, and as you say, it could be from any class, then they come in to sort of do their health visit and their breastfeeding, and then they are picked up and then support is targeted on them where it's needed. Those have been really cut back, so I think and they've been much more tightly targeted on low-income areas and low-income families. So I think we've lost that. So I would agree that that's a problem. Then the 3 and 4 year old places go to every child. So that is a universal plank in the system. The 2-year-old places and other childcare funding is targeted on, till recently, has been targeted on the most needy children. So that's going on the assumption that it is children from the more disadvantaged backgrounds, from lower income backgrounds, maybe whose families aren't working, maybe who are recent immigrants. Those are the ones who stand to benefit most from an earlier start, from coming in at 2. Maybe they're missing out on those opportunities at home. So I think the way what Labour used to say was it's progressive universalism. There's a universal bit for everybody, but then we're trying to provide more for the families that need it most. That was the ideal, but they did it within a very fragmented system, which has its own problems, I think.
So I have to understand that beyond the 25 hours and for the working parents, they have to find another solution on their own. Or they pay.
Yes. Okay. Usually it's the same solution. So they'll be in the day nursery and they'll pay the extra hours. That's right. So there's nothing for them. Well, now there's the 20%. So you pay money into a childcare account and the government tops it up by 20%. So there's a little bit of support, additional support. But that's right, yeah, beyond 20, it used to be, well, currently, beyond 15 hours you're on your own, and when they introduce this new policy, it'll be beyond 25 hours you're on your own, yeah.
So I understand that going to work for a family or for parents, it's an expensive choice if you have children. Because you seem to say that for early child, before 3, they have to pay the full bill. And there's private resources, and you say it's expensive.
Yes, it's very expensive, and it's a problem. So there's some criticism of this decision to focus the extra money on on the 3 and 4 year olds, because that's nice. When they get to 3 and 4, it's really quite subsidised. But when you're making that decision to go back to work, when your child is 6 months old, a year old, it's very expensive. And if it's your second child, if you have 2 children under 3, it's really extortionately expensive. I mean, it's certainly a point at which women often drop out of the labour market when they have their second child. It really is a problem. I agree.
And you were talking about quality a little bit, saying that quality is an issue, but also compared to the cost and the affordability, sometimes affordability get first. What are your concerns about quality from your perspective?
My concern is about child well-being and child development. So I think it's great for women to be able to work, and they should have that choice. And it should be like what we call a double dividend. It should be that it works out for family finances, and it's a good thing for the child, and it supports their development. But we know that bad quality can have the opposite effect and can be even negative for child development. So my worry is that we lose sight, or we need to keep both of those things on the table. So, for example, they're changing the funding now in order to pay for these 25 hours, which are going to go to working families. And in order to find the funds to do that, they've announced that they're changing the funding formula in a way which will pull money out of the maintained nursery schools and the nursery classes. And it looks very unlikely to me that those settings, which have been agreed by all to be high quality, will be able to hold on to their teachers. So I think as someone who's concerned about child development and inequality between children at a young age, I think that that's the wrong choice. I'd like to see money going in to support the costs of childcare for higher earners, and I agree with you that that's probably a cost-effective decision in the long run for the economy, but I'm really against doing that at the expense of the quality of provision for disadvantaged children.
Thank you very much.
I just have a question, a follow-up on quality, actually. Who's responsible for evaluating the quality inside different kind of program? You talked before about the evaluation of the program that is installed for 3- and 4-year-olds, but is it the government that is supporting the evaluation? Is it researchers, experts? Who's evaluating the quality of the program in England?
So I referred to a few. Do you mean in general overall, or the evaluation projects that I referred to?
The evaluation project that you referred to.
So those evaluations, I think, were done by the Department for Education, effectively. So they piloted programs. They piloted a graduate leader fund, which was supporting graduates, and they piloted places for 2-year-olds. I think those are two of the things I referred to, and they evaluated them using RCT methods, so to see would it have an effect. And they found the graduate leader fund did have an effect in improving the quality. Having a graduate there improved the quality of provision in the classroom. They've gone on to abolish the graduate. A different government has gone on to ignore that and abolish the graduate leader fund, okay? And they found that those 2-year-old places only had an effect on child development if the children were in a high-quality setting. And they've gone on to expand the programme and let 2-year-olds go into all sorts of settings that aren't high quality. So an example of how research isn't always useful for us to have the research. It's difficult sometimes to get policymakers to act on it when there's money involved.
This is exactly why I asked the question, because if it were the government, well, it's very unlikely that they will go on the opposite of their funding, although it's possible. But it wasn't the government or the Ministry of Education. It was researchers, actually, that did this evaluation.
It was researchers funded by government, so it came out under...
So
government commissioned it. Researchers did the report.
Okay.
We then had an election and we got a new government.
Okay.
So
I understand. Thank you.
They weren't so interested in the old report. Yeah. Ideology sometimes wins over evidence, I think, occasionally.
I have two quick questions. One with regards to governance. Who is, in fact, in charge of early childhood education? You talk about the Department of Education. Is there another department involved, or is it under the same department?
No, it's basically... Well, it's interesting because it's there in the Department for Education, which under the previous government was renamed the Department for Children, Schools and Families. So it was very much specifically the department for, not just for education, but for children and families. So Sure Start was there, and childcare and early education was there. And now it's changed to the Department for Education, and that department still has the responsibility, but I guess the change of name maybe talks to the... It seems a bit more homeless. Young children don't have a sort of natural home, perhaps, in the way that they did before. Now, the department... There is another issue about this, actually, which is... and in fact, this is important, I think, that some of the funding comes from the Department for Work and Pensions because it comes through the tax credit system. So the targeted childcare support for lower income families comes through them. And that meant it's got really hit under welfare reforms. I think it was just seen as part of we had austerity reforms which really hit our benefit system, and childcare support got hit as part of that, I think. So that was a problem that it was there, whereas education was relatively protected. The other thing is that a lot of the funding is now devolved to local authorities. And local authorities have also been very, very hard hit. Some of them they've lost 30 to 40% of their budgets under austerity measures after the financial crash. And so you've seen a lot of budget squeezing that's affected young children. Even some authorities have tried to protect young children, but they've faced really difficult decisions. So actually, the education department was relatively protected, but where the funding sat in other places as well, which has been a problem.
And finally, you mentioned that good quality would be like double dividended in a sense, good for working force and good for children. Do you know of any studies that would have been made in the UK or any other studies that would have been made on the dividends that would be gained from for the children on the children's side, more so for the development of the children? So when you invest when you put money into a development of children, you get a gain, or you know what I mean?
So one very influential study in the UK has been the EPI study. Have you come across that? EPPE. It's by Kathy Silver and colleagues. But it's a little bit dated now, but it was very influential because they followed children from the 1990s. They went into the nursery settings where children were, and they measured the quality of the provision there and the interactions between adults and children and so on. And now they've tracked those children until they're now 14, I think, or maybe even a bit older. And so they find that if you went to what they said was a low quality setting, there's really no effect, or certainly it fades out very quickly. Whereas children in settings with high quality, you see those effects continuing on until even at 14, you see some language effects and social and behavioural effects as well. So that's one that comes to mind, the EPI study. Others have been much more sort of short term. There aren't that many that look at children, that manage to look at children's outcomes, actually. So there's a lot that look at the quality of provision, but I can't think of any others that have managed to track through and record outcomes, but I could have a think about that.
Thank you.
One more question. You co-authored a comparative study. 8 countries, I think, were examined, and they were chosen because they involved mixed economy of early care and education services. So I just wanted to know if those countries were France, UK, of course, Netherlands, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, US, and Norway. I'm sure you contributed regarding the UK part, but do you know of one model that you would advise us to look at more closely in terms of the effects for children's development?
Yes, I think Norway, definitely. And there's interesting things about lots of them. Mm-hmm. New Zealand was really invested heavily in qualifications. They had a big push towards having much more highly qualified staff. So if we're focusing on child development, and the other really high quality providers, I think there are France and Norway.
Okay.
And some US states actually who had very interesting things going on in terms of quality developments. So there's a big state variation, but
okay.
So I would ask you, when you have seen these other countries, would you emphasize the fact that quality is related to better development and consistently development?
When I would looking at the evidence from those countries.
Yes.
Yes, I think so. Certainly the US study cites US evidence that has found that to be true. And I think the New Zealand study does. I don't think any of the other countries had done research into that, no.
But when you were referring to your colleague Kathy Silva and her study, you said that one of the conclusion was in quality services, the children were developing more consistently and were getting to school more well prepared. Were you saying that, or I'm wrong?
In the Kathy Silver study,
Yeah.
yes, because they had better language. They had better language and better social and behavioural development if they'd gone to high quality settings. They measured them at 5, at 7, at 11 and 14. And they also look at the quality of the schooling. So you do get interactions and you get fade out. If they went to a high quality nursery, but then they went to not such a good school, they lose some of that advantage, or they lose all of the advantage. But they certainly find that it's, yes, I mean, you're asking about the 5-year-olds. Yes, they're better prepared for school when they're 5 if they've been to a high quality setting.
And I was just wondering, in your mega study with other countries, if that conclusion seems to be shared about quality and effect.
Yes, I think it's definitely shared. Whether the robustness of the evidence from those different countries, I think I'm just trying to think about whether they presented their own evidence or they're referring to other studies. So I think, I think the introductory chapter to that, where we review the evidence on quality and outcomes, I think is where we pull together some of these studies. I'm not sure that most of them, maybe there's one in a New Zealand study that they looked at this, but mostly they weren't focusing on that. They were focusing on how to get I guess the focus was, how do you get the poorer children to access high quality? They weren't themselves making the case that was important. I guess they were taking that as read, rightly or wrongly.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kitty Stewart, for the time, for your generosity. I think we used up our time. So I know it's late also in UK. So thanks a lot, and we'll keep you informed of our work and the results.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to seeing that.
Thanks. On va prendre un petit 5 minutes pour permettre à la prochaine présentatrice de se présenter, de s'installer. Il s'agit de Suzanne Major. Donc, on se retrouve dans 5 minutes. Bonjour, bonjour. Alors, on va reprendre. Alors, nous avons la prochaine présentatrice qui est sur place avec nous à la Maison du développement durable, Suzanne Major de l'Université de Montréal. Alors, le titre de sa présentation est « Postmodernité en éducation en petite enfance ». Alors, vous étiez là aux présentations précédentes, une quinzaine de minutes, suivi des échanges avec les commissaires. Merci beaucoup.
Oui. Alors, bonjour, merci de me recevoir, c'est très apprécié. Vous allez constater probablement que ma présentation, elle détonne un peu, elle est différente des autres présentations qu'on a entendues là, hier et aujourd'hui. Mais je pense qu'il y a certainement un apport là, qui est au niveau de des études qui est différente, mais certainement complémentaire, je pense, d'accord? Donc, voilà. Alors, la présentation s'intitule « Postmodernité en éducation en petite enfance », dans le sens que mon rôle ici, c'est de témoigner d'un nouveau mouvement, si on veut, qu'on peut voir en éducation en petite enfance, et un mouvement qui est présent, qu'on va retrouver dans des centres de la petite enfance qui sont tout nouveaux, qu'on retrouve notamment aux États-Unis, en Norvège, comme disait la dame avant, et puis dans différentes localisations. Donc, je vais essayer de vous présenter cet aspect-là. Je me suis penchée surtout sur la question de la qualité du programme éducatif, donc le programme éducatif qu'on utilise, nous, dans nos centres de la petite enfance. Donc, tout le monde connaît Jouer, c'est magique, le programme éducatif de CPE, et maintenant le programme qu'on utilise qui est Accueillir la petite enfance. Donc, la chose sur laquelle je me suis penchée, c'est la qualité diluée, si on veut, du programme éducatif en ce moment, puis son application qui est très, très hétérogène dans les services de garde en ce moment. Je me suis penchée aussi sur la question de la formation des éducateurs et des éducatrices en petite enfance, et cette idée que je pense qu'il faut commencer à réfléchir là, rapidement sur la création d'un ordre professionnel pour cette profession-là, ou cette profession à devenir, je devrais dire, parce que ce n'est pas une profession pour l'instant. Et je me suis aussi penchée sur la question de la gouvernance, mais surtout sur l'aspect de philosophie et leadership en petite enfance. Et dans le document écrit, vous aurez peut-être l'occasion là, de le consulter. À la fin du document, il y a des photos sur des centres qui sont tout nouveaux, qui sont très, très différents de ce qu'on connaît. Et les centres, notamment du Step by Step Family Center qui appartient à la communauté Mohawk, tout près de Montréal. Il y a le Hortswood de Pennsylvanie, le Forest Schools dans les provinces canadiennes, les modèles des pays nordiques et de la Corée du Sud. Alors, ce sont des gens qui ont travaillé dans le même genre de système que nous, donc des centres de petite enfance très similaires avec le même genre d'objectifs et tout ça, mais qui ont tourné le dos à ce système-là pour mettre en place un nouveau système qui disons, a un lien qui fait appel à un programme éducatif qu'on appelle l'éco-éducation en petite enfance. Donc, c'est un lien avec, évidemment, comme vous pouvez l'imaginer, l'écologie et la préparation des petits-enfants pour un monde futur. Donc, voilà. Alors, au début du document écrit, j'ai posé la question quels étaient nos désirs d'enfants, c'est-à-dire quelle sorte d'enfants qu'on veut avoir au Québec là, dans les prochains 10 ans ou 20 ans. Et c'est une question, je ne suis pas sûre qu'on s'est posée en 1997. Alors, moi, je suis là depuis avant même 97. Donc, j'étais très présente lors de la création des centres de la petite enfance et tout ça. J'ai fait partie de ce mouvement-là. Et je ne suis pas sûre que c'est une question qu'on s'est posée à cette époque-là. Donc, on a voulu répondre aux besoins des adultes. On a voulu donner accès aux femmes au marché du travail, ce qui est très bien. Je veux dire, c'est tout à fait correct. Mais on a contribué beaucoup à la condition féminine, mais on ne s'est pas arrêté sur la condition enfantine, je pense. Et certains éléments, je pense, de ma présentation se penchent sur cette question de la condition enfantine. D'accord? Il y a un nouveau paradigme, et ce nouveau paradigme-là est lié aux écoles que j'ai mentionnées, le Step by Step Family Center et Hortwoods et tout ça. Et c'est un mouvement qu'on voit en ce moment qui prend beaucoup d'ampleur, qui est relié à une organisation qui s'appelle le RECE, ou les Américains ou les Australiens diraient le RECE, qui est le Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education. D'accord? C'est un mouvement qui existe depuis quand même une quinzaine d'années, je pense, et qui rallie, associe des spécialistes en petite enfance de tous les domaines. C'est-à-dire, il y a des psychologues, des travailleurs sociaux, des éducateurs, il y a toutes sortes de monde, mais ces gens-là ont en commun la petite enfance spécifiquement. Et ces gens-là critiquent beaucoup l'approche qu'on a de l'éducation en petite enfance en ce moment, c'est-à-dire le type de programme qu'on utilise notamment à accueillir la petite enfance, qui est inspiré de leur high scope, de l'approche américaine. Donc, c'est tout ce qu'on appelle la pédagogie compensatoire, d'accord? Intervention, prévention, intervention précoce et prévention et tout le reste. Donc, ils critiquent ce système-là, ils ont des problèmes avec ce système-là parce que le système, il est discriminatoire, cause beaucoup de problèmes, d'exclusion chez les petits-enfants, etc. Donc, c'est juste pour vous présenter l'idée. C'est sûr que c'est difficile d'expliquer tout le paradigme au complet, mais en tout cas, je vous présente l'idée comme telle. Et ce qu'ils avancent, si on veut, comme trame de fond, c'est cette idée que on a, dans la modernité, c'est-à-dire jusqu'à maintenant, on a beaucoup utilisé la science pour mettre de l'avant toutes sortes de statistiques d'évaluation pour voir au bien-être du développement des enfants et tout le reste. Mais évidemment, cette époque-là a eu des effets pervers, si on veut, sur la qualité de vie des petits-enfants. Alors, on voit maintenant des gens qui disent, OK, les résultats scientifiques, c'est très beau, les grilles d'évaluation, c'est bien, etc., mais ce ne sont que des outils. Alors, ce qu'ils proposent de faire, c'est de présenter, d'opposer, si on veut, à ça, ou de complémentariser, si on veut dire, tous ces résultats scientifiques-là avec une approche philosophique, pour essayer d'établir un équilibre dans l'éducation en petite enfance, en fait, puis dans les objectifs éducatifs qu'on peut avoir et tout ça. Qu'est-ce que je voudrais dire à propos des programmes éducatifs? Comme anthropologue, j'ai passé beaucoup de temps à l'intérieur des CPE, donc des dizaines et des dizaines de CPE, des garderies privées, des services de garde en milieu familial, accrédités, non accrédités, je les ai à peu près tous faits. Et en passant beaucoup de temps dans ces milieux-là, il est très évident que le programme éducatif qu'on connaît à accueillir la petite enfance, il n'est pas appliqué. D'accord? C'est-à-dire, on le nomme, on peut le nommer, on le laisse sur une tablette quelque part, d'accord? Mais quand on discute avec les éducatrices et les intervenants, c'est pas du tout évident qu'ils le maîtrisent, qu'ils le connaissent, qu'ils sont capables de l'appliquer non plus. Puis il y a des raisons, je pense, des explications pour ça. Alors, c'est pour ça que je parle d'une application diluée là, du programme éducatif et d'une application qui est hétérogène. Hétérogène dans le sens que quand on va d'un service à l'autre, et qu'on regarde le programme éducatif qu'ils mettent en place dans la réalité, pas celui qu'ils disent qu'ils font, mais celui qu'ils font dans la réalité, on voit que d'un CPA à l'autre, d'un service de garde à l'autre, c'est extrêmement différent. D'accord? Alors, si on a tous des programmes différents, puis c'est tout appliqué d'une façon différente, c'est tout utilisé d'une façon différente, à ce moment-là, on n'a pas de contrôle sur la qualité de service en ce qui concerne le programme éducatif en soi. D'accord? Je me suis penchée sur la question de la formation du personnel. Alors, moi, je suis responsable du programme Petite enfance à l'Université de Montréal. On a près de 800 étudiants dans notre programme, donc c'est beaucoup de monde. On les forme depuis 1998-99 à peu près. Donc, la formation, c'est quelque chose qu'on connaît bien. Il y a des faiblesses pédagogiques au niveau de la formation qu'on retrouve du personnel éducateur. Alors, vous savez comme moi qu'on voit beaucoup du personnel qui est formé en technique d'éducation à l'enfance au niveau collégial, ce qui est correct, ce qui avait été demandé en 97. Puis on comprend qu'en 97, on n'avait pas les finances pour développer un réseau à grandeur de la province, puis en plus payer des salaires de professionnels. Donc, on comprend qu'à ce moment-là, ils ont demandé une formation technique avec le salaire qui vient avec aussi, là, dans ce sens-là. Donc je pense que c'était un problème de départ qu'on a eu. Ensuite, ce qui s'est passé, c'est justement l'offre de services a été tellement grande qu'on a manqué de personnel. Donc, pour répondre à la demande, on a élargi l'éventail des qualifications qu'on pouvait demander aux éducatrices en petite enfance. Alors, on s'est retrouvés finalement, en bout de ligne, avec un personnel qui est extrêmement hétérogène. Donc, on a des gens qui, en fait, ont des qualifications dans tous les domaines possibles et imaginables. Donc, on a des gens qui ont des AEC, des DEC, des certificats universitaires, des bacs, même des maîtrises. Et puis, on a des gens qui, en fait, ont été formés en psycho, travail social, en orthophonie, en toutes sortes de choses. Donc, lorsqu'on les retrouve dans le milieu, bien, ça fait du monde qui ont des bagages académiques très, très différents. Ce qui fait que quand on vient pour appliquer le programme éducatif, c'est un autre problème, parce que là, on ne se comprend plus. Là. On n'a pas le même langage, on n'a pas le même bagage et tout ça. Dans mes recherches et dans les travaux que j'ai effectués à travers les différents CPE et garderies privées et tout, c'est l'exception, je peux vous assurer, c'est l'exception qui est capable de nommer les 5 principes de base du programme éducatif. Juste là, on a un problème. D'accord? Alors, si on n'est pas capable de nommer les principes de base, on n'est pas capable non plus de discuter de l'approche éducative qu'on a, qui est en fait officiellement l'approche démocratique. On n'est pas capable non plus d'expliquer c'est quoi le processus de l'intervention éducative. C'est notre jargon en éducation, si vous voulez, petite enfance, d'accord? Donc, le personnel bloque là. Donc, il n'y a pas de transfert de connaissances, si on veut. D'accord? Il y a des CPE qui y arrivent, notamment le CPE Ville-Mont-Royal, si vous avez l'occasion d'aller le visiter. Je pense que c'est vraiment un CPE exceptionnel. Mais ils ont eu la chance d'être formés directement par les intervenants de High Scope directement. Alors, ils sont venus dans le CPE des États-Unis pour les former. Alors, c'est très différent. Donc c'est ça. Donc, on a un personnel qui a une formation technique et un personnel qui assure les soins primaires. C'est-à-dire qu'on va assurer la sécurité, le bien-être et les soins primaires. Puis je pense que ça, on a réussi à faire ça. D'accord? Je pense que ça, c'est assez acquis. Donc, si on assure les soins primaires, on n'applique pas, je pense, qu'on n'applique pas le programme éducatif. Puis on a beaucoup de travail à faire en termes de l'application du programme éducatif. D'accord? Transfert des connaissances, utilisation des techniques d'éducation et tout le reste. Puis, c'est pas parce qu'on n'a pas les outils. On a tous les outils, on a toute la documentation, elle est toute là. D'accord? Donc, c'est un héritage qu'on a eu de High Scope, mais c'est pas appliqué, c'est pas utilisé. Il y a un nouveau phénomène sur lequel je voulais attirer votre attention, puis c'est un phénomène qui est très insinueux, je pense, très alarmant aussi, je pense. Et on assiste, vous savez, je suis beaucoup sur le terrain, donc on assiste à un retour de l'éducation autoritaire et punitive en service de garde. Et ça, il faut s'y arrêter, là, puis il faut que les gens se posent des questions puis disent comment ça se fait qu'on retourne en arrière dans ce sens-là. Donc, on avait éliminé depuis 1997 pas mal cette approche punitive des enfants. Donc, on a une approche qui est démocratique. On protège leur estime de soi, on favorise leur développement, on est à l'écoute, etc., etc. Puis ça nous échappe, là. Puis on voit depuis à peu près 2-3 ans que ça nous échappe. Et on s'est posé évidemment la question, nous, à savoir comment ça se fait qu'on voit ce retour d'une approche qui est punitive. Vous savez, une approche punitive, là, je veux dire, là, des tapes là, données aux enfants en service de garde, là, d'accord? Puis de l'enfermement, puis de l'exclusion, puis des punitions, puis ce genre de choses qu'on n'avait pas vu depuis un bon bout de temps. C'est sûr qu'avec les dernières modifications des moyens de financement là, des services de garde et tout ça, on a assisté à un développement des garderies privées d'une façon explosive, d'accord? Mais aussi un développement massif des services de garde en milieu familial non accrédités et aussi de garderies privées, c'est-à-dire pas des services de garde en milieu familial, mais des garderies privées sans permis. Donc, ça existe beaucoup, en fait. Alors, si vous descendez sur le trottoir, puis vous vous promenez dans les quartiers, puis vous ouvrez les portes de ces garderies-là, c'est un phénomène qui existe. Alors, nécessairement, ces gens-là, s'ils sont d'aucune façon contrôlés, supervisés, monitorés, etc., bien, ils font ce qu'ils peuvent. Hein? Ils font ce qu'ils peuvent. Alors, ce qu'on va voir comme phénomène, c'est que les gens vont éduquer les tout-petits comme ils ont été éduqués. D'accord? Il n'y a pas de formation, il n'y a pas de programme éducatif, pas de concept en arrière de ça. Donc, on voit un retour de cette violence faite aux enfants, une violence physique, violence verbale, violence, beaucoup de dénigrement, beaucoup d'insultes, etc. Donc, un retour, si on veut, à une façon d'éduquer plus traditionnelle, plus ancienne. Donc, je pense que il faut le dire, puis il faut réaffirmer publiquement cette décision qu'on avait prise d'avoir une approche démocratique de l'éducation en petite enfance, puis de l'imposer à tout le monde, là. d'accord? Puis de le faire comprendre qu'est-ce que ça veut dire, d'accord? Parmi les propositions que vous retrouvez dans le document écrit en soi, je propose un plan stratégique, c'est-à-dire concernant la formation des éducateurs et des éducatrices en petite enfance. Il faudrait faire un plan général pour voir à professionnaliser le travail du personnel éducateur. Dans un premier temps, il y a une professionnalisation à faire. C'est pas une profession, hein, vous savez, c'est juste une job, là, c'est un travail technique même. Donc, il y a moyen de professionnaliser ce travail-là pour assurer la qualité de service. D'accord? Dans des provinces canadiennes, aux États-Unis, un peu partout à travers le monde, ça prend un bac. Hein, pour travailler en éducation petite enfance, dans les services de garde, ça prend un bac. Donc, nous, on n'est pas là, donc on a beaucoup de travail à faire au niveau de la formation comme telle. Un plan stratégique aussi pour voir à normaliser les pratiques, c'est-à-dire, on utilise un programme éducatif. Je pense que c'est essentiel d'avoir un programme éducatif de base, obligatoire pour tous, même les services de garde en milieu familial. D'accord? Il peut y avoir des couleurs, il peut y avoir des variations, mais certainement un programme de base, de fond, pour assurer une certaine régularisation des pratiques. Là, d'accord? Et aussi au niveau des interventions éducatives, comme je disais tout à l'heure. Il y aurait moyen, à l'intérieur de ce plan stratégique-là, d'arrimer le travail des techniciennes en éducation. C'est-à-dire que dans nos services de garde, on a des gens qui ont une AEC puis un DEC en technique d'éducation à l'enfance. D'accord? Ce sont des techniciennes. Et on a des gens qui sont formés à l'université, qui sont formés en éducation en petite enfance dans différentes institutions, notamment à Montréal. Et on a aussi, par le fait qu'on a un éventail de types de personnel qui est très, très grand, on a aussi des intervenants en intervention psychosociale. Donc, on retrouve tout ce beau monde-là qui travaille comme éducatrice en petite enfance, si on veut. C'est intéressant comme phénomène. Pendant un certain temps, c'était dommage parce je pense qu'on aurait eu avantage d'avoir des gens qui étaient formés en éducation petite enfance pour travailler dans nos services. Mais bon, la vie a été comme ça, puis les années ont été comme ça, puis les coupures budgétaires et tout le reste ont amené une variété là, au niveau du personnel. Mais finalement, quand on s'arrête puis on regarde, si dans mon CPE, j'ai des gens formés en éducation petite enfance, des gens en technique d'éducation, des gens en éducation, des gens en intervention, bien là, on a des ressources humaines intéressantes. On a un groupe de ressources humaines qu'on peut regarder autrement, puis qu'on pourrait peut-être utiliser autrement. Alors, prendre quelqu'un qui a une formation en psycho, pourquoi est-ce qu'elle travaille, elle prendrait le travail d'éducatrice en petite enfance, pourquoi pas la shifter, si on veut, la déplacer pour qu'elle travaille plus auprès des enfants besoins particuliers, par exemple. D'accord? Donc, au niveau du personnel, des ressources humaines qu'on a dans nos CPE, il y aurait moyen de revoir comment on utilise le personnel, puis comment on divise les groupes par rapport aux différents besoins des enfants. D'accord? Développer la profession, voir à mettre sur pied un ordre professionnel pour tenter de régulariser les pratiques puis d'établir une chaîne, là, si on veut, de qualification possible. Voir à rémunérer le personnel selon leur qualification. C'est très dommage d'avoir des gens qui travaillent comme éducatrices en petite enfance qui ont des bacs ou qui ont des maîtrises même et qui sont payés le même salaire que des gens qui ont une AEC. On n'est pas dans un monde comme ça. Il me semble que ça devrait être autrement. Je sais que ça coûte très cher. Je ne suis pas dans un univers d'argent, alors, mais je suis dans un univers d'idées. Alors, voilà, je vous les propose comme tel. Par ailleurs, je vous parlais tout à l'heure d'un nouveau paradigme qui est présenté en petite enfance. Et je pense qu'il y aurait avantage de réfléchir sur une philosophie de l'éducation en petite enfance au Québec. D'accord? 97, là, en 1997, on a eu une vision. Les CPE, c'était absolument magique. Pour l'avoir vécu, pour avoir été là, c'était un projet de société qui était beau, qui était magique, etc. C'était une vision. Et ça a été mis en place, etc. Mais là, le projet a souffert l'usure du temps, là, si on veut, mais je pense que maintenant, on est probablement rendu à cette nouvelle phase-là, un tournant, là, où on peut profiter maintenant de ce questionnement qu'on se pose par rapport au CPE pour se dire, qu'est-ce qu'on veut là, pour les enfants? On est rendu où, etc. Est-ce qu'on peut mettre sur pied une philosophie ou adhérer à une philosophie de l'éducation en petite enfance? Et une philosophie, ce qu'il y a de conciliant avec ça, c'est qu'une philosophie pourrait s'appliquer à tous. D'accord? Si on pouvait définir cette philosophie-là ou s'en inspirer, en fait, de d'autres personnes, là, comme on va voir un peu plus tard dans la présentation. Donc, parmi les nouveaux, à l'intérieur du nouveau paradigme, quand on regarde les gens qui ont rejeté nos centres de la petite enfance, si on veut, notre façon de concevoir la pédagogie compensatoire, entre autres, ils ont mis de côté l'évaluation normative, par exemple. Vous savez, les grilles d'évaluation, les critères de développement, les points de repère du développement et tout. Ils ont tourné le dos à cette approche-là, à cette façon d'éduquer les petits-enfants. Ils ont opposé, si on veut, tous les résultats de recherche scientifique, ils y ont opposé une philosophie de vie, une philosophie par rapport à l'éducation des petits-enfants. Et on va voir un peu plus tard, notamment, on parle en Corée du Sud, on parle de sinmyeong, c'est-à-dire la joie de vivre en petite enfance. Au lieu d'être dans un contexte d'évaluation, puis de normes, et etc., et d'exclusion aussi. Hein. Donc, cette joie de vivre, on voit chez les Norvégiens le concept du bildung. Puis le bildung, c'est un concept qui est vraiment très intéressant, où là, au lieu de regarder les points faibles des enfants, au lieu de regarder la classe sociale dans laquelle ils sont venus au monde ou sa situation de monoparentalité ou quoi que ce soit, au lieu de regarder ça, ils se penchent sur les points forts et les atouts qu'un enfant peut avoir, peu importe le milieu où il est venu au monde. Alors, c'est des éléments qui ont complètement changé leur approche de l'éducation de petite enfance, en fait. Je me dépêche. Pour établir un leadership, je me suis penchée aussi sur cette question-là. Vous irez voir dans le document écrit. Je pense que le leadership en éducation à petite enfance, ça appartient pas à une structure gouvernementale, ça appartient pas à un groupe professionnel ou à des experts ou quoi que ce soit. Le leadership, ça appartient vraiment à tout le monde. C'est vraiment à tout le monde. On aurait avantage à redécouvrir l'éducation à la vie, en opposé à l'éducation à la société. Alors, quand on éduque, par exemple, en ce moment, on est dans un système où on éduque les enfants pour qu'ils rentrent à l'école puis qu'ils réussissent à l'école, cet aspect de la vie humaine a pris toute l'importance au détriment d'une éducation à la vie qui vient de la famille. Alors, lorsqu'on regarde tous les milieux possibles de vie et d'éducation des petits-enfants, qui partent de la famille, des services de garde apparentés, des services de garde moins formels, plus formels, jusqu'à la maternelle. Donc, ça nous donne un éventail de possibilités de milieux de vie et d'éducation qui est très riche, en fait. Je propose de voir aussi une conciliation famille-expert-État. Donc, ramener la famille dans le jeu, sans exclure les familles, d'accord? Les familles elles ne sont pas incompétentes, les parents ne sont pas incompétents. Ce sont les premiers éducateurs de l'enfant et on a intérêt à les ramener comme partenaires dans l'éducation des petits-enfants. Et finalement, dans cette question de leadership-là, je propose il serait peut-être intéressant de mettre sur pied un conseil de la petite enfance. D'accord? Et un conseil de la petite enfance où on aurait les gens présents là, ce seraient les parents, les éducateurs, les gens qui travaillent avec les petits-enfants, qui pourraient notamment s'assurer de protéger les droits des enfants, s'assurer de leur stabilité, de la sécurité et le bien-être. Je vous dirais que d'un changement de gouvernement à l'autre depuis 1997, une des plus grandes difficultés qu'on a eues dans les CPE, dans les services de garde, c'est ces bouleversements constants de normes, de règles, de lois, de financement, de ci, de ça, qui créent un stress important pour le personnel éducateur, pour les directions et éventuellement pour les enfants automatiquement. Je pense qu'il est vraiment temps là, de commencer à dépolitiser la petite enfance au Québec, là. D'accord? De sortir la petite enfance des crocs des politiciens là, qui tentent de gagner des votes à droite et à gauche. Là. Donc, il faut stabiliser l'environnement. Et pour le stabiliser, je pense qu'il faut passer par la famille et les éducateurs. Dernier point, les différentes écoles, je les mentionnais tout à l'heure, Step by Step Family Center, ça vaut vraiment la peine d'aller les voir, de voir comment ils travaillent. C'est vraiment intéressant. Reggio Emilia en Italie aussi, Hortwoods, les Forest Schools. Ce qu'ils ont en commun, je pense, tous ces nouvelles écoles, c'est le fait, par exemple, que dans les installations, il n'y a pas de jouets. Il n'y a pas de jouets, littéralement, pas de jeu, pas de jouets, okay? Parce qu'ils n'en ont pas besoin, tout simplement. Alors, ce qu'ils ont choisi comme approche, c'est de reconnecter l'enfant à la nature. Et on est dans un bon édifice pour apporter cette idée-là, je pense. Donc, de dire, écoutez, quand on regarde un local dans un CPE, un local d'enfants, faites l'inventaire de tout le matériel qui se trouve là. Okay? C'est extrêmement limité. C'est limité au niveau du matériel pédagogique, c'est limité au niveau des expériences qu'on peut faire, c'est exigu parce que les locaux sont très petits, etc. Et si on tourne le dos à ça et on ouvre la porte sur l'extérieur, sur le dehors, sur la nature, à ce moment-là, on a un matériel pédagogique qui est absolument infini, des expériences qui sont infinies, beaucoup, beaucoup plus riches qu'on pourrait retrouver dans les locaux d'un centre de la petite enfance. Les Forest Schools, je pense au Canada, en font la démonstration absolument parfaitement, là, parfaitement. Donc, aux Forest Schools, par exemple, les tout-petits sont carrément dehors toute la journée. Hiver, été, pluie, soleil, peu importe, tout le monde dehors. Un peu comme nous, quand on était petits, dans les années 50 et 60. Donc voilà. Alors, il y a beaucoup, beaucoup de matériel. Ouais, c'est l'apport anthropologique puis, et philosophique, donc ça fait des présentations qui sont très différentes. Je vous écoute.
Bien, vous venez de me voler mon introduction parce que d'abord, je voulais vous remercier parce que je ne sais pas si c'est le fait d'être anthropologue ou l'angle que vous avez pris, mais vous nous amenez ailleurs. Ça, oui. C'est certain que vous nous amenez ailleurs. Puis on souhaitait cette diversité-là, fait qu'on vous en remercie en partant. Ça n'empêche pas que moi, j'ai plusieurs questions et de compréhension. Et puis, je ne veux pas débattre en termes d'être d'accord ou pas d'accord. Je vais m'appliquer à comprendre votre propos. Quelque part, même si vous prônez une sorte de... En fait, votre diagnostic qui est assez sévère, vous dites... Ma question, là, clairement, c'est, vous semblez dire qu'il y a un problème, il y a un programme de base, jouer c'est magique, accueillir la petite enfance, qui est appliqué de façon diluée et par du personnel, finalement, qui n'est pas très cohérent, c'est très hétérogène dans l'application, etc. Mais je voudrais vous poser la question, comme base de départ, ces deux programmes-là, est-ce que c'est recevable ou pas recevable, ou même le point de départ vous apparaît? Parce que quand vous allez dans votre recommandation plus à fond, vous semblez dire qu'on devrait se délester de ce genre d'approche-là pour aller vers une autre approche. Mais au jour d'aujourd'hui, là, ce qui est présenté comme base, est-ce que c'est satisfaisant ou pas? On a-t-il un problème d'application, de compréhension, de formation au cours d'emploi, ou si on a un problème au départ même conceptuel, selon votre point de vue, bien sûr?
C'est sûr qu'à l'origine, Jouer, c'est magique, qui a été le premier programme qui a été écrit, là, qui a été mis sur papier, c'est inspiré de l'approche High Scope, d'accord? L'approche High Scope, elle est validée scientifiquement, donc c'est un excellent programme. Définitivement. C'est de la pédagogie compensatoire, c'est clair, d'accord? On verse vraiment dans la prévention, l'intervention précoce et tout le reste, préparation à la maternelle et tout ça. D'accord? C'est une base qui est quand même assez solide. Le problème, c'est qu'avec les années, le programme lui-même a été dilué. Donc, on n'a pas... si vous regardez Accueillir la petite enfance, puis vous le comparez, par exemple, à Jouer, c'est magique, on a éliminé toute l'application pédagogique. Ce qui fait que quand on lit Accueillir la petite enfance, c'est des grandes théories, des grandes orientations. Donc, quand on arrive dans la pratique, très difficile à appliquer. D'accord? Donc, on a perdu, en fait, quelque chose de très riche qu'on avait au départ. Alors oui, il y a un problème de connaissance du programme d'origine, du vrai programme éducatif qu'on a, en fait. Et il y a un problème de transfert de connaissances, c'est clair. Puis le transfert de connaissances, c'est aggravé par le fait qu'on a un personnel qui est hétérogène. Tout à fait.
J'ai plusieurs questions, mais je vais commencer... par revenir sur cette question de programme, j'avoue que je suis un peu surprise de vous entendre réclamer un programme éducatif, d'autant plus que la majorité des experts qu'on a rencontrés, là, vous étiez là dans les derniers jours, nous ont dit « ne faites pas ça ». Et c'était d'ailleurs ma question à notre spécialiste là, qui provenait de l'Angleterre. Il semble avoir en fait une adaptation des programmes qui est faite. Et je comprends mal en fait comment... J'essaie de voir, parce que pour moi, c'est seulement des lignes directrices qui sont données par le ministère, mais ce n'est pas un programme éducatif. Les programmes éducatifs doivent provenir, en fait, selon le ministère de la Famille. Là, je vous dis ce qui est mentionné, puis vous me direz votre interprétation de ça, parce que je pense que je ne suis pas au même niveau. Là. Selon le ministère de la Famille, il y a des orientations qui sont données, et chaque centre, garderie, peu importe, est responsable de développer le programme éducatif. Et donc, est-ce que vous percevez les lignes directrices de la part du ministère comme étant le programme éducatif? Est-ce que c'est ce que je dois comprendre?
Bien, la ligne directrice du ministère, c'est accueillir la petite enfance. D'accord? Donc, le document lui-même, c'est les grandes orientations, les grandes directives dont l'approche démocratique là, qui élimine le problème de violence, là, entre autres. D'accord? Et tout ce souci de la préparation à la maternelle, il est dans accueillir la petite enfance. Et je pense que comme programme pour tous les types de services de garde, je pense que c'est essentiel pour normaliser les pratiques et aller chercher une certaine qualité de service. Autrement, ce qu'on fait, c'est que les gens font n'importe quoi, puis ils vont appliquer les interventions, ils vont utiliser des interventions éducatives qui sont très, très, très personnalisées. Et au bout du compte, on n'a pas tous le même résultat. Qu'est-ce qu'on veut avoir? On veut préparer, on veut que les enfants soient préparés pour entrer à la maternelle. Je pense que tout le monde est d'accord avec ça. Que ce soit les enfants à besoins particuliers ou les enfants tout venant. Là. Et puis, je vous rappellerai, vous savez, hein, que la grande majorité des enfants dans nos services de garde sont des enfants en santé, normale, tout venant, joyeux, etc. Et que ce n'est qu'une partie, une petite partie, qui sont des enfants à besoins particuliers, il ne faut pas l'oublier. Donc, établir un programme éducatif pour tout le monde, surtout pour donner une base, une trame, si on veut, pour tous les services de garde. Puis après ça, si les services ont besoin de se personnaliser en adoptant Montessori ou en adoptant Reggio, ou ben là, pourquoi pas, là, t'sais.
Donc, vous privilégiez plus une approche du style adopté par le ministère de l'Éducation avec un programme normé où les gens ont des compétences à atteindre et où on applique ça et après ça, les gens déterminent comment faire en fait les démarches pour atteindre la compétence au cours de l'année. Est-ce que c'est ce que je comprends?
Absolument.
C'est absolument ça. OK, parfait.
Absolument. Vous savez, il faut faire, chez les éducateurs, les éducatrices en petite enfance, il faut avoir le même cheminement professionnel qui s'est passé chez les infirmières, par exemple, ou chez les enseignantes primaires préscolaires. Donc, tout le monde formé de la même façon, avec les mêmes objectifs, les mêmes connaissances, le même bagage. Alors, comment voulez-vous voir au développement d'un enfant de sa préparation à la maternelle? Ou c'est pas juste du développement psychologique, là, c'est de l'introduction à la culture enfantine, etc. Donc, définitivement, faut resserrer un peu les liens là, pour avoir pour avoir une profession, là, pas juste un travail que n'importe qui peut faire. Là.
J'ai juste une question, Pierre, ce sera pas long. En fait, c'est une question en deux temps. D'abord, permettez-moi d'être surprise d'apprendre qu'on a une approche punitive de table de punition et d'exclusion, alors que je pensais qu'on avait des lois régies, que lorsqu'on frappait des enfants de moins de, 7 ans, on était donc accusé au criminel. Donc, permettez-moi d'être très étonnée de voir, premièrement, qu'il n'y a pas de poursuite qui se passe. Oui. Deuxièmement, pouvez-vous m'expliquer ce qu'est une approche démocratique? Parce
Absolument.
Que visiblement... je n'ai jamais été là, au fait de cette approche-là. Il semble y avoir une grande différence. Et là, je me rends compte aussi qu'on s'adresse à des enfants qui sont quand même 5 ans et moins. Donc, comment adopter une approche démocratique? En tout cas, dans ma tête, à moi, c'est une approche où on discute puis on échange avec l'enfant. Absolument. Mais 5 ans et moins, je me demande jusqu'à quel niveau, en fait, on peut vraiment négocier, disons. Dans mon approche démocratique, je négocie, et là, je comprends mal. Je dois avouer, expliquez-le davantage pour que je comprenne un peu où vous allez avec ça.
En fait, depuis le début, là, jouer, c'est magique. Le programme éducatif des CPE, accueillir la petite enfance, tout ça, c'est la même chose. Tout le monde a mis de l'avant une approche démocratique. Puis une approche démocratique, ce que c'est pas nécessairement une approche de négociation, là, mais c'est une approche d'écoute. C'est-à-dire que l'éducateur observe, documente, regarde, écoute, reçoit ce que l'enfant avance. Puis à partir de ça, l'éducateur est supposé d'établir des objectifs éducatifs pour le faire cheminer. D'accord? Alors, l'approche démocratique, c'est ça. Donc, c'est pas on ne dirige pas les enfants, on n'est pas autoritaire, on leur dit pas quoi faire. C'est l'enfant qui décide ce avec quoi il veut aller jouer. Hein? Chaque enfant est unique, vous savez, tous les principes de base. Là, c'est lui qui s'occupe de son développement global et intégré, etc. Donc à la base, on avait ça depuis 1997. Et puis, je vous dirais que jusqu'à il y a 2-3 ans, ce qu'on voyait dans les milieux, c'est qu'effectivement, plus ou moins, on avait cette approche démocratique-là, même si les éducatrices ne pouvaient pas nécessairement le verbaliser puis l'expliquer d'une façon intellectuelle. On avait ce respect de l'estime de soi des enfants et on ne voyait pas une présence de punition physique ou quoi que ce soit. Mais dernièrement, d'accord? Parce qu'il y a plein de services de garde qui rouvrent n'importe comment, d'accord? Bien là, les gens ne sont pas formés, ne sont pas inspectés, il n'y a pas de régularisation. Et puis parce que c'est massif, ce développement qu'on voit sur le marché, bien là, les gens, vous savez, ils n'ont pas d'autres référents que la façon dont ils ont été éduqués. Alors, on voit ce retour de cette violence physique envers les enfants. Dernièrement, il y a un de mes chargés de cours, moi j'ai 30 chargés de cours là, à l'université, et il y a un de mes chargés de cours qui est un grand spécialiste. Je n'ai pas demandé sa permission, je ne mentionnerai pas son nom, mais c'est un grand spécialiste en psychoéducation, en fait. Et son petit-fils, dans un CPE, d'accord, il se présente un matin au CPE, et puis la directrice fait venir des enfants dans son bureau parce qu'ils n'ont pas été gentils ou je ne sais pas quoi. Alors, il est témoin de ça. Donc, l'éducatrice qui amène l'enfant au bureau de la directrice pour recevoir sa punition, vous vous imaginez? D'accord? Cet enfant-là frappé, là. Donc, c'est plus répandu qu'on pense. Et il faut s'arrêter, il faut le regarder. Moi, je discute avec des éducateurs, des éducatrices à petite enfance à longueur de semaine. J'ai des témoignages à toutes les semaines de gens dans des garderies privées, des services de garde en milieu familial, évidemment, accrédités, non accrédités, dans tous les milieux, même les CPE, où il y a une approche qui est punitive. Je ne vous dis pas qu'on les massacre, les enfants, là. D'accord? Mais j'avais confiance qu'on avait mis un terme à cette approche où on frappait les enfants pour les éduquer, là. Oui.
Ben, je vais peut-être aller ailleurs, moi, dans le sens où, bon, vous avez commencé en parlant de postmodernité,
oui.
Comme anthropologue, et puis en même temps aussi avec ce que vous avez pu observer. Bon, ça fait 20 ans, effectivement, puis vous dites que, bon, on ne s'est pas penché vraiment sur ce qu'on voulait, comme peut-être le mot est mal choisi, vous me corrigerez si je me trompe, là, mais de portrait, au fond, de l'enfant qu'on souhaite, dans le fond, développer, ou en tout cas, vers où on le souhaite l'amener. Et puis, vous avez également expliqué que, bon, le leadership appartient à tout le monde en ce qui a trait à l'importance de la petite enfance, puis dans vos recommandations, dans vos observations, bien évidemment, vous nous parlez dans le fond, de changer un peu notre regard. Et puis, vous parlez d'un concept de la petite enfance, donc de rendre la petite enfance, dans le fond, un enjeu important et capital pour la société. C'est un peu ça que j'entends. Comme anthropologue, est-ce que vous avez vu, vous avez observé justement une progression de la présence de cet enjeu-là au sein de la population en général? Et puis, et sinon, pourquoi on ne le voit pas? Comprenez-vous?
Qu'on ne voit pas exactement.
Pourquoi ça ne deviendrait pas nécessairement un enjeu? Parce que pour en arriver à ce que vous recommandez, il faut que les gens adhèrent à ça, je pense. Il faut que ça devienne un enjeu pour fédérer, dans le fond, la population du Québec autour de ça. Et comment on peut... Parce que c'est quand même jeune, là, ça fait à peine une génération là, qu'on a changé là, notre façon de faire et d'aborder l'éducation à la petite enfance. Et pour que ça devienne de plus en plus un enjeu, comme vous le souhaitez, est-ce que vous avez observé, vous, justement, une progression des mentalités, si je peux dire, par rapport à l'importance de l'enjeu de la petite enfance? C'est un peu ça.
Ce que j'ai remarqué dernièrement, d'accord? J'ai eu plusieurs témoignages à cet effet-là. Vous savez, dernièrement, lorsqu'on a changé le financement des frais de garde et tout ça, puis on est passé au crédit d'impôt et après ça, puis là, on assiste en ce moment à un phénomène où les parents quittent les CPE et s'en vont vers soit des services de garde en milieu familial non accrédités ou peu importe, ou des garderies privées. Donc, on a vraiment un exode qui est en train de s'organiser. Donc, j'ai discuté beaucoup avec des parents qui faisaient ça, qui avaient fait le choix de quitter les CPE pour aller vers d'autres systèmes. Puis, évidemment, il y a tout l'enjeu de l'argent, c'est clair. Là, ils disaient, c'est plus profitable, ça me coûte moins cher, etc., etc. Mais il y a un autre enjeu qui est ressorti, qui est très, très intéressant. Et ce que les parents me disaient, c'était que je vais le dire comme ça, ils en avaient marre de se faire dire que leurs enfants avaient des besoins particuliers. Vous savez, on est entré dans une phase de surévaluation, de surdiagnostic des besoins des enfants. Et les parents trouvent ça très, très dérangeant, très agressant. C'est terrible de se faire dire que ton enfant a un retard de développement. Là. Et le problème, c'est que ce diagnostic vient d'une éducatrice en petite enfance qui a une AEC ou un DEC. Là. Okay? Il y a quelque chose qui ne marche pas ici, là. Absolument pas. Moi, je peux vous dire d'expérience, d'accord, que la grande majorité des enfants, ils n'en ont pas de problème de développement. Il y en a beaucoup qui sont mal élevés. Ça, on est d'accord avec ça. Mais des problèmes de développement, c'est juste une partie de la population enfantine. Là. C'est pas, d'accord? Alors, les parents, les parents que j'ai vus qui transféraient des CPE, qui s'en allaient vers des services non régis, ce qu'ils me disaient, c'est que, bon, là, c'est assez, là. Moi, je prends le contrôle, je me retrouve dans un service de garde en milieu familial, puis là, c'est moi qui le bosse. Fait que c'est pas elle qui va venir me dire que mon enfant a un retard de développement. Moi, je vais dire à cette personne-là que mon enfant est normal, puis il va se rendre à la maternelle comme tous les autres enfants, etc., etc. Donc, on a ce phénomène qui existe, là. Ouais.
Ce matin, on s'est fait... Puis c'est la beauté de la chose, là. On a des points de vue différents, mais ce matin, on avait une madame qui s'appelle Susan Prentice, je pense, qui disait... L'essentiel, c'est que ça prend un positionnement, comme un statement d'État qui dit, mettons, comme on a dit en éducation en 63, c'est on veut que nos jeunes soient éduqués, on veut que ça se fasse, c'est une priorité nationale, c'est gratuit, on le prend en main. Je rappelle ça, là, je ne suis pas en train de défendre sa position par opposition à la vôtre, mais je me dis... Elle allait même jusqu'à dire « Créons les structures, faisons en sorte que les gens ont accès à des services de qualité, puis même éventuellement accès en priorité à la qualité, parce que la qualité viendra après. »
Oui, tout à fait.
Vous nous proposez un autre modèle complet. Vous dites « Dépolitisons », ça veut dire... Alors moi, je vois le conseil de la famille. Ce que j'entends, c'est une voix. J'entends l'importance que vous accordez à ce que la petite enfance ait une voix, pour qu'on n'oublie pas son importance, qu'on n'oublie pas. Mais en termes de leadership, je vous questionne, votre approche où il n'y a pas un porteur politique, parce que vous allez même à dire il faut le dépolitiser, comment vous voyez le lien entre une voix et des actions qui en découlent? C'est ma préoccupation. Là. Je me dis, si vous dépolitisez, puis qu'il y a une voix, comment ça va se transférer en opération, en positionnement politique, en argent d'État? Parce qu'une des choses qui était dite, puis c'est à peu près ce qu'on a vu partout, peu importe le modèle qu'on prend, puis il y a des modèles qui sont... C'est comme si on retenait que les parents, quand ils reçoivent un montant d'argent, à la limite, l'enjeu financier prime sur beaucoup d'enjeux. Enjeux qualitatifs, enjeux... Puis peut-être que vos exemples je ne les critique pas, vous les avez observés, là, mais quand vous dites, il y a des parents qui en ont ras-le-bol de se faire diagnostiquer, puis ils veulent aller comme dans du léger, là, ils se disent, garde, on va envoyer mon enfant, là, puis il va être en sécurité, il va être...
Dans la normalité.
Bon. Alors, je vais vous entendre là-dessus, votre positionnement si clair de dépolitisation dans un système tel qu'on a aujourd'hui, dans le système qu'on est. Expliquez-moi mieux.
On a besoin... C'est sûr qu'on a un réseau, d'accord, de services de garde. Puis je pense que ça répond à un besoin de la population qui est assez évident. Là. Il faut travailler ce réseau-là, il faut augmenter la qualité des services dans ce réseau-là, notamment pour la formation du personnel éducateur. L'idée, je pense, c'est de créer une structure qui va venir comme garder un peu, protéger le bien-être, l'atmosphère plus stable, c'est ça, la stabilité, le bien-être dans les services de garde. C'est-à-dire une structure qui dirait, on a des politiciens qui arrivent, ils proposent un programme, ils proposent une nouvelle intervention, on va faire ci, on va faire ça. Bien, avoir cette structure-là qui dit, bon, attention, là, si vous changez le financement ou si vous changez le programme éducatif ou si vous changez les lois et les règlements, etc., ça a un impact direct sur les enfants. Il nous faut quelqu'un qui protège les droits des enfants en service de garde. Okay? Ce qui, pour l'instant, ça ne se produit pas. On a le ministère de la Famille qui vu à implanter un système qui régularise, etc. Mais avec toutes les coupures budgétaires et tout, là, on a perdu des plumes. Donc, on n'a pas cette supervision là, au niveau de la qualité des services et tout le reste. Donc, cette instance-là, ce que ça viendrait faire, c'est que ça vérifierait ce que les
une sorte de garantie sociale qu'on se donne pour protéger
les droits des enfants et leur bien-être directement.
La qualité du système, etc. Une sorte de structure ombudsman là, qui protège, dédiée à l'enfant, qui protège l'enfant. Je vous comprends, là, je n'affirme pas, là, je veux être sûr de... OK.
C'est correct.
Je vais prendre là-dessus. Juste une dernière question sur... vous avez parlé d'un ordre professionnel, vous n'êtes pas la première à l'apporter. On a vu hier Nathalie Bigra et Andréane Gagné nous en parler également. Donc, j'aimerais un peu savoir pourquoi un ordre professionnel. Qu'est-ce que ça viendrait faire plus que ce que font les syndicats actuellement? Est-ce que c'est parce que le système est très... morcelé? Est-ce que... Donc, j'aimerais un peu vous entendre là-dessus. Je n'ai pas posé la question hier, je m'en suis voulu, donc je la pose à vous.
C'est bien correct. Donc, un ordre professionnel, je vous dirais beaucoup plus pour se pencher sur l'application d'un programme éducatif, d'accord? Puis de régulariser les pratiques éducatives, puis les interventions éducatives, et aussi de voir à prendre en compte le transfert des connaissances. C'est-à-dire qu'on a un personnel qui est hétérogène, qui est formé à des niveaux académiques qui sont différents. D'accord? Alors, il faut se pencher là-dessus puis regarder, bon, qu'est-ce que les gens font, qu'est-ce qu'ils sont capables de faire. On a besoin de normaliser un peu là, ces différentes approches-là. Alors, l'ordre, ce qu'il viendrait faire, c'est dans un premier temps dire, OK, on a différents niveaux de formation au niveau des éducatrices et des éducateurs en petite enfance. On a des éducateurs et des éducatrices en petite enfance qui ont des formations plus spécialisées aussi. Donc, l'ordre viendrait comme quantifier tout ça et aussi permettre une rémunération adéquate selon le niveau de formation des personnes. Ça a un lien direct avec la qualité des services, là. Absolument direct, d'accord? Une des choses que j'ai remarquées dans les services de garde, quand on a une éducatrice en petite enfance qui a une formation en technique, d'accord? Lorsque ça fait un certain bout de temps qu'elle travaille dans les services de garde, elle va développer une expertise au niveau de l'efficience. D'accord? C'est quelqu'un qui est capable de recevoir 20 enfants, les rentrer dans le CPE, leur donner de la bouffe, les faire laver leurs mains, etc. Donc, une efficience au niveau des soins primaires, de l'octroi des soins primaires, et une efficience pour le déroulement de la journée. Donc, elle est capable de partir du point A et arriver au point B à la fin de la journée, puis dire, on a fait une bonne journée, on a fait ce qu'on avait à faire, etc., etc. Mais c'est de la technique. D'accord? Cette personne-là ne fait pas d'observation, de documentation, incapable de faire des rapports de développement, ce qui existe. Hein? On a tous ces outils-là. Là. Donc, elle n'a pas cette disposition-là. Par contre, dans nos services, on a beaucoup de gens qui sont formés à l'université, à l'UQAM notamment, et à l'Université de Montréal. Probablement aussi à l'Université de Sherbrooke. Donc, on a des gens qui ont une formation universitaire qui pourraient justement prendre en charge tout ce côté pédagogique là, de documentation puis de référence. Vous savez, il faut pas, quand on regarde nos services de garde, il ne faut pas juste penser besoins particuliers. Il ne faut pas juste penser développement socio-affectif. Il y a toute la question de la préparation à la maternelle. Et en fait, on parle de prélecture, préécriture, logique et prémathématique et tout le reste, là, vous savez, qui était dans Jouer, c'est magique au départ. Là. Sauf que ça a été oublié, ça a été échappé en cours de route.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Major, pour votre
plaisir.
présentation, le temps que vous y avez mis. Alors, vous êtes la bienvenue pour poursuivre avec nous. Merci beaucoup.
Juste m'assurer, Madame, on a votre mémoire,
oui.
Et votre PowerPoint, vous allez nous le laisser.
Il est sur le bureau.
OK, parfait.
Il est sur le bureau. Sinon, je vous l'enverrai si vous le perdez.
En fait, si vous pouviez donner votre clé USB à ma collègue, ça serait super. Parfait. Donc, on va tester la connexion dans les prochaines minutes avec notre prochain invité. Il s'agit de Michael Perlman, qui est professeur associé à l'Université de Toronto. Donc, aussitôt que la connexion fonctionne, je vous reviens. Hello.
Hi there.
Good afternoon, Michael Perlman.
Michal, that's me, but
Michal. Okay, I'm sorry.
the video hasn't come on yet
Okay.
from my end. I can see you guys, but
Okay, wonderful. We can't see you yet, but we can hear you very nicely.
Reminder that I better change my my Skype photo. That's my son from years ago.
That's okay. So maybe I'm going to say just a few words of introduction while the image is loading.
Sure.
So first of all, welcome and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
My pleasure.
As a reminder, this Commission on Early Childhood Education in Quebec is an initiative of the Association québécoise des centres de la petite enfance, and its objective is to assess the current situation regarding early childhood education services and make recommendations in terms of public policy to forge our collecting vision of the future. So I'm here today, Mallory, I believe we spoke over the phone, from Institut du Nouveau Monde. My organization's mandate is to ensure the neutrality of facilitation of the Commission's activities, and the ones that are in charge of assuring the independence and non-partisan aspect of the Commission are the Commission members that are sitting by me. Still unable to see us, right?
I can see you just fine, but I can
okay.
also
It's
see
us who can't see you.
I can also see that you can't see me.
Yeah, okay. So sitting by my side is André Lebon, the Commission member's chair. Martine Desjardins, and then Pierre Landry. And so the objective of this public hearing with experts is to inform those Commission members of the most recent research results, also to provide them a very broad view and research perspectives on early childhood education. So we are hearing 20 experts from Quebec and from outside of Quebec as well to broaden our perspective. And this activity is taking place in the lead up to the Commission's tour of Quebec, consultation tour. So in the next 2 months, we'll be visiting 14 cities and meeting with citizens and organizations as well, to help to enable our assessment task. So I think this will not load, this image, so we will just go forward. I'm sorry, the people here in the audience who won't be able to see Ms. Perlman's presentation, but I believe that us Commission members, we have the
So you have a
paperwork.
copy of it? Is that
Yeah,
right?
we have a paper copy of it. So thank you for sending it in advance. It's helping in this type of... Sorry? Oh, okay. So maybe I'm informed that maybe you could still try to share your screen. So
Sure.
if you see on the bottom of your screen a plus sign and you click on it, you can try sharing your screen and then maybe we can see... there we go. We see your screen at the moment. You just have to choose... There we go. Okay.
See the presentation? Okay.
Yeah,
great.
so now we see the presentation.
Okay. Well, that's better than seeing me.
Okay, so you have a 15 minutes presentation time that will be followed by a question and answer from Commission members. If we have some extra time, I will allow the audience to also ask a question. And I remind you that people are listening to us live on our broadcasting channel. So they can't see the presentation, but they can hear. So here we go.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join you. And if along the way there's something that you want me to elaborate on, just let me know. I know you've heard from some remarkable researchers over the last day or two, so some may overlap and feel free to guide me along. But I'm going to be talking about assessing early childhood education program quality for monitoring and for quality improvement purposes. I'm sure you've heard about and are aware of the extent to which kids are in early childhood education and care programs many hours each day. There's some writing showing that many kids spend more of their waking hours in ECEC programs than they do at home. And there are also findings that children who attend higher quality programs have better outcomes. And by outcomes, we're talking about language, we're talking about early school achievement, we're talking about social and emotional outcomes. And one of the findings has been that it's particularly helpful for kids who come from at-risk backgrounds. And if you could see me, you'd have quotations around the at-risk, because that means different things. But for researchers, often we use family income and family education as kind of proxies for the risk factors. We know from research that overall the quality of these programs tends to be mediocre. And I saw that Krista Japel was speaking to you, so I imagine that you know more about this, particularly about the Quebec landscape. But overall, there's a lot of room for improvement in the quality of care that the average child receives. And one of the other factors to keep in mind is that the at-risk kids, and these are the kids that I just mentioned, stand to benefit the most from good quality programs, tend to find themselves in the worse quality programs because often it's related to cost. So center care tends to overall offers better quality care than family home care, although there's lots of exceptions. But it also tends to be cheaper. So the families that are considered at risk often end up placing their kids in that type of care. So that's kind of the context. And I've mentioned quality. I just wanted to spend a very quick moment defining what quality is. Generally in the literature, people talk about structural quality. Those are the characteristics that are more easily quantifiable. So it involves things like staff-child ratios, group size, staff education, things that are easier to count. They're the things that government tends to regulate, I think, because they're easier to count. They're not necessarily that straightforward to count either, but it's probably a story for a different day. They are thought to set the stage for process quality. And process quality focuses on interactions, and that's what the kids in care experience directly, right? So a child doesn't experience the staff member's degree. They experience how the staff member interacts with them. And the logic is, or the thinking is that the staff education affects how they interact with the child, and then that's what matters to the kids directly. In terms of what the research is showing us is the most important aspect of quality for supporting child development, we're getting convergent evidence that it's really the interactions, the quality of the interactions between the staff and the kids that matters the most to kids. And when I talk about interactions, I mean warmth and responsive, so how positive the staff are with the kids, but also something that I'm going to refer to as cognitive attunement. Maybe that's a little jargony, but it's not just about being warm and responsive to the kids. It's about understanding what the child understands and responding to that child with that information in mind. And I think that when you think about really young kids, that's what teaching is. It's that piece about the adult understanding things from the perspective of their child, and by way of an example, modifying their language so that the child is able to understand what they're saying, and enriching their learning environment cognitively through that attunement. But it's certainly the case that across the board, it's the interactions that seem to be the key factor. Now, assessing interactions is hard, and especially if we're talking about it from not just from a research perspective, but from a quality monitoring perspective. But it's not impossible. There are ways to assess the way that staff interact with kids, the way they talk to them, the way they discipline them. through observations in ways that are valid and reliable. And those are the key things. The information needs to capture the true experience of the kids, and it needs to do that consistently. Another piece of this puzzle that I think is relevant when we're thinking about monitoring quality is that there are large gaps in what parents know about their children's programs. So when parents are asked even fairly basic questions about what the center or the provider where their child is cared for, they often have inaccurate information. And a number of studies, including one that we've done, have looked at parents' ratings of the program quality, the center quality, and observer-based but researcher valid and reliable measurements, and they have very little to do with each other. I think what the picture is that quality is not transparent, and parents are not very good at seeing. Well, it's not a transparent thing. This interaction, the way I've just described it, I'm sure you can imagine that it's not an easy thing to walk into a room and see right away. And so I think the logic is that since the consumer, in this case, the parent, who's often the one making the decisions on behalf of the child and for their family, isn't really able to necessarily tell what the quality is, it creates a role for government to help with monitoring quality. And it's not just for parents, it's other stakeholders. Childcare, one way or another, is heavily funded by government, even outside of Quebec. And so for accountability purposes, I think there's a need to look at quality and look at the kind of quality I've been talking about. One way that this has been done on a large scale is through what people call QRISs, Quality Ratings and Improvement Systems. And these systems revolve around an in-depth assessment of quality that almost always includes an observational component to try and capture the kind of things I've mentioned or been talking about. So just by way of an example, many people in the room will be familiar with the sanitation grade for restaurants. In many localities, there's a public health or different agencies that rate restaurants. Typically, the rating has consequences, right? You post a poor score on the window and people won't go to that restaurant because in the case of this rating, it suggests that the hygiene is poor. I'm not suggesting we apply a model exactly like this to childcare. Apart from anything else, there are many restaurants. People have lots of options in the restaurants they go to. They don't have lots of options. Often, they don't have lots of options in childcare. So that the context is very different. If we shut down a bunch of childcare, that places a whole lot of families in very stressful situations. So I think that the situation in childcare is more complex, and we need to look at something that looks a little more like this than what I just showed you. Where the assessments, if you look at the oval in the center, are embedded in the context of quality improvement strategies and support provided to the programs. They're embedded in making the information available to parents, that funding is available to improve quality. So it's not, if we think about that restaurant model, I sometimes jokingly call it rate and run. The rating is posted and that's it. I think in the case of EC programs, there needs to be a system built around those ratings, not just the rating. The rating itself isn't sufficient to improve the quality of care. There are many systems that operate in the way that I just described in play. In the U.S., it's a very strong movement of QRISs. Typically, that measurement, that central oval from the previous slide in these U.S. systems is a kind of combination of structural and process quality measures. They generally have ratios, education, a few other factors, and an observational measure of the quality of staff-child interactions embedded, and they create one score. And they post that score, they make that score available so that parents can use it in making decisions, but they also tie funding to those scores. I was involved in doing some work on Colorado's quality assurance program through the RAND Corporation a while ago. And then when I moved to the University of Toronto and started working with the City of Toronto, because in Canada, different localities have different make different efforts at quality assurance, but Toronto is really the lead, I would say, on implementing a system like this. So I came from Colorado, or the research was in Colorado, where basically the better programs were rewarded, but one can easily flip that around and say, let's support the poorer quality. So rather, the assessments are conducted and they're the center, but the way that they're used is really a value-laden judgment. And you can decide, in the American capitalist way, let's reward the strongest, or you can decide to say, okay, well, let's support the weakest. But at least there's a way of identifying those programs through the assessments. These kind of systems are not easy to implement. You need to train the assessors, and they need to be able to assess the process quality, not just the structural quality pieces. Measuring is labor intensive. It's complex because to keep a pool of reliable assessors, trained assessors, and it's generally an iterative process. By way of an example, many of the states that began implementing systems like this ran into a problem, and the city of Toronto ran into a similar problem where they started using a scale that, on a 4-point scale, but then they found that the programs, as they improved, started to bunch up at the top, and the scale didn't allow differentiation at the high end. And so in order to really continue the quality improvement process, they wanted to move to a 5-point scale, which has all kinds of complexities because it's sort of changing the standards on the programs all of a sudden. So it's a dynamic it's a dynamic intervention that still has to be applied in a very systematic way. So in Toronto, just to give you a flavor, the City of Toronto uses the assessment for quality improvement tool that was developed here. They do have a rigorous inter-rater reliability protocol and a pool of, they call them QAAs, quality assurance analysts, who do the assessments. They post all the scores online. They're very frequently used. They've put research money into validating the AQI, the measure that they use. And there's I think, increasing interest in doing that. Other municipalities in Ontario have adopted this approach. A couple of other approaches that have been used in Canada. Alberta has an accreditation process. It's not a rating system in that it's a pass-fail, unlike the QRSs, which are generally on a 4 or 5-point scale. But they don't have an inter-rater reliability process, at least to the best of my knowledge. Manitoba has used a very well-known instrument called the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale Revised. That's that ECHRS that you see up there. But they only use it in one classroom. And I don't know how familiar you are with these programs, but they always have multiple rooms. So there's measurement issues. It's always a cost-benefit analysis, right? The reason to use one classroom is that it's cheaper, and you still get some information about the program. So different localities have approached things in different ways. But with similar underlying logic, I would say. So just a few quick conclusions. I think it's fair to say that quality is important. It's important for the kids. It's important for families and therefore for society. Interactions are the key, but they're hard to capture. They're hard to see in quotations, and that means that stakeholders need help in assessing quality. Quality is hard to measure, especially this interaction part, but it's doable. There are proven ways to do it. There's no easy way to do it, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to. And that's it. Now into questions.
I have two questions. My first question is on your first slide. You said that children who attend higher quality ECEC programs tend to have better outcomes. And after you specify that it's more clear for at-risk backgrounds. But you say it's quite true for everyone. Am I right? I understand you well.
Yes. I mean, it's a messy literature. It's a literature that I've spent more time than I'd care to admit trying to understand. So this is where you'll get the academic hedging, right? People measure quality in different ways. They measure the outcomes in different ways. They report in different ways. So it's not, the empirical basis is not totally, it's the opposite of clean. But there are lots of studies that show effects across domains in terms of outcomes. If I think that the findings are clear-cut, that high-quality services, and it's not just childcare, have the biggest bang for the buck, in quotations, is for the kids who come from environments that are less resourced. So I think that's definitely a finding from the literature that I can be more confident in reporting. But there's also many studies that show that across the board kids benefit from these sorts of programs too.
Okay, thank you very much. My other question is about your system of assessment, the QRIS.
Yeah.
I understand that you use it in Toronto, and the result is available to the population.
Yeah, you can log on and check what any they only conduct the assessments for centers that provide care for kids who are receiving a subsidy. So basically, the kind of leverage that they have is if a center wants to provide care for kids who receive a subsidy, then they have to enter into a contract with the city of Toronto, and part of that contract is that they have to agree to undergo this assessment, which the city then conducts. It's about 2/3 of centers that have this arrangement with the city and undergo an annual assessment. I should have mentioned that these assessments are generally conducted annually, and then the score is posted online. You can go and look up any center as long as it's one of those 70% or so of the centers in the Greater Toronto Area, and you get their quality rating. In Toronto, they don't. They post the AQI score. They don't combine it with the structural factors, which a lot of the U.S. systems do. There have been some simulations, some research done on which aspect best predicts child outcomes, and it's actually the interactions piece. So I think it's better. What the city does here is probably the smart thing to do, which is just to post, not to try and combine across different aspects of quality and create one score out of it, but to present it separately.
Okay, about it, 2 questions. If there's a poor assessment, is there some? Do you ask for correction or
if there's a poor assessment?
Yeah. Is there an issue about funding? Can they lose their funding, or can they have less
Yes.
money?
So what I was saying earlier is that what government or whatever bodies do with the score varies according to different locations. In different locations, in Toronto, they've one of the things. Well, they use the measure for 2 different purposes simultaneously. One is if the quality falls below a certain threshold, they won't contract with that provider to provide subsidy care. So that's a big piece of the business. That's a big deal. So that's a first piece. The other is trying to, in the more fine grain, if you look at the gradations of the scale, drive the entire system towards providing higher quality care. In terms of flexibility, different localities have done it in different ways. Sometimes they allow an appeals process in some states where they can request an additional assessment, but cost is a factor in these situations. And generally, the argument is this is a snapshot of what the quality was on the day that the assessors came, and therefore it holds until the next round of assessments is done, like any other test that one would undergo.
And so the fact that they actually put their evaluation up front, you think it has an influence on the parents that is looking for a high quality childcare center?
Sorry,
or does it the money influence more the parents? I'm sorry.
I didn't understand the question.
Yeah.
Can you-
Okay. Is actually, in your opinion, with that kind of evaluation up front, which the parents can see it and see, well, this center is better than the other, does it has more influence on their choice for a childcare center, or is the money, because we were having a lot of economic expert that were saying actually parents are more influenced by the economy, so that they can make by going to a center or to another. So do you see an influence for the parents?
Well, so when you ask parents, when researchers ask parents what factors are they considering when they select care, and when I, as a developmental psychologist ask, not just economist, they give us the pragmatic reasons first. The hours, the cost, the location. They do cite quality. So they certainly, they mention it as a factor. If you look at a place like Toronto, where there is a pretty severe shortage of care, I think that parents are lucky to feel lucky, and in reality are to get a space that I think in environments where there's such a shortage, it's sometimes hard to even think about parents making a choice, right? Because they take the care that they can get. But the website that posts these scores, last I looked at it, got upwards of 10,000 hits a month. So they're certainly looking, and I think that the more that the information is available, the more they'll use it.
Okay. And we had a lot of experts saying that we need to evaluate our system in Quebec in 3 years. For example, we evaluate, and 3 years from now we evaluate again centers. But you seem to be looking into centers in Toronto that is being evaluated. Well, you assess quality each year. Is it better?
Most of these systems assess quality annually. I think that there's a lot of interest, just to save money, in reducing the frequency of the assessments. Government's talking about it in different ways, even about licensing. I don't know if you guys have had people talk to you about risk-based stuff. Mm-hmm. And so the notion there is that if there are programs that have a certain trajectory, like they've been very good for X number of assessments, maybe you don't need to assess them manually, or maybe you can do a reduced assessment, or maybe you can have a subsample that's randomly selected, where assessments are done annually. It is a cost-benefit analysis, right? So, and my feeling whenever these conversations come up is that that as long as it's done in an empirically based way, it's testable to see whether, if you change the assessment schedule, whether programs drift, whether program quality drifts in between years. Generally, the approach with QRISs, and certainly what happens in Toronto, is annual assessments. I've done, along with a student, Peter Varmuza, we've looked at the stability of quality over time to see whether we could identify a subgroup of programs that are good enough for a stable enough period that one could comfortably say, let's come up with a different assessment schedule for a subgroup, as long, with all sorts of caveats, like if the program is sold, or if the director changes, it triggers the annual assessments. It doesn't look to me like there would be cost savings at this point, sufficient cost savings to warrant all the administrative challenges of doing it, because there's variability in quality from year to year. But at any rate, I think it's an empirical question as to whether one can shift to different schedules, and if it's possible, then that would be a good way to do it more efficiently.
Okay, maybe my last questions. When you're looking into quality for each center, you look into a perspective for scholarship for those young children, or do you look into quality for their development? Because it's a very different perspective when actually you're planning childcare system. And so which one do you prefer and why?
Well, I am a developmental if I've understood the question, I come at it from the perspective of the child.
Yeah.
Like what in the environment supports children. And I think that, their families, of course, are a part of it. So it has to involve the broader family. But what is it? I look for factors that we know are the things that help children develop their potential. I do talk about instruction to young kids. People usually sometimes they don't like the language, but when I talk about instruction for young kids, I think about it. I'm not talking about worksheets. I'm talking about creating linguistically rich environments that are at the developmental, the level that is appropriate for the children in a particular context. So I'm not sure I understood your language about scholarship, but
it was schooling, actually. You got it, actually. It's instructions. Actually, it's like a planning. You're assessing quality with in mind that you're planning that they will be entering school shortly and they need to be prepared instead of their own development, and each children is very different. So it's the two options for me to look into quality.
One would hope that they would converge. The kind of thing that sets kids up for school success, really young kids, like if we think about toddlers, is a environment that's linguistically rich. So having staff who talk to the kids a lot at a level that is a little bit beyond what the kids are capable of on their own. That's kind of if you guys I don't know if people have talked to you about scaffolding and that it's called the zone of proximal development, the things that kids are capable of with a good facilitator. So they're not, it's sort of it's the place for optimal learning. It actually doesn't just apply to kids, but the environment where if someone scaffolds their behavior and helps them, they can do more than what they're able to on their own. We want adults who come in and not 100% of the time, but help kids in that area achieve things that they can't yet do on their own. For 2-year-olds, that may mean counting the blocks as you stack them. It's not worksheets, but it's definitely cognitively enriching. And I think that language is a central piece of it.
One more question, please. On your slide saying assessing interaction is hard.
Yes.
The third one was parents' assessment of quality is not associated with objective measure.
Yeah.
So what? And it's a paper in preparation. So what looks like is important for the parents at first sight? So in that study, we went into about 100 classrooms, and we administered a number of well-researched standardized measures. They included measures of staff-child interaction, but they also included the structural ratios, education, and so on. The interaction measures, and then we tried to use the measures that we had collected as predictors of the parent ratings. We had the parents rate the quality of the room, of the program on a number of items. And none of the interaction terms predicted the parent scores, meaning there was no association between these objective measures that we were using that are research-based and so on, and the parent ratings. If I remember correctly, ratios was the only predictor, and that's understandable because it's easy to see,
right? You can walk in and you can count the number of adults, the number of kids. Walking in and seeing, is the adult cognitively attuned to the child? That's really hard to do. This is a complex piece. Parents are not spending a lot of time in these rooms, so they don't necessarily have the opportunity to see these kinds of interactions. And we know that from research that if you look at how long parents spend when they're running in and dropping their kids off and rushing off to work, it's limited. And there's all kinds of staffing issues. So at pickup, when generally parents might have a little bit more time to linger, often the staff who are there all day are not there any longer. So this is a kind of a can of worms that is very complex to try and understand. But I think, and it's not just the work that we've done, I think it's safe to say that because much of what parents are looking for is transparent, or at least it's not transparent. I think there are systematic ways to look at it, but it's hard to see. It makes it very difficult for them to make decisions that are really informed, because they just, it's hard to reach those determinations about things like cognitive attunement.
Just a quick question on the slide, which is entitled, "What is quality?"
That must be before this one. Yeah.
So you're talking about structural aspects with staff-child ratios, group size, staff education. Now, with regards to staff education, what would be the minimal level of education, or what would be the requirements to ensure a minimal quality in staff education, given the fact that you are talking about in the process that your staff and child interactions are important interactions, with parents are important, peer interactions and everything? Thank you.
Yeah, so, it's not an easy question to answer, for the same reason that when you kind of ask for clarification about the links between quality and child outcomes, again, the research is messy. I've actually been trying to integrate the findings on staff education, and people use it. They operationalize it in research in different ways. Sometimes they look at BA, not BA. Sometimes they have 5-item scale of like no high school to PhD. Sometimes they look at years of education, and it's very hard to pull them all together. And it's hard to look at them in relation to either the process outcome or the child outcomes, for that matter. I don't think that the evidence is there that it has to be a BA. I think that there's a lot to be said for the ECE degrees. So those typically are 2-year community college programs that focus more on. They have often a heavy internship component, so the trainees are spending time in programs in a supported way. So I think that the ECE the ECE degree, from a community college is probably a good marker, but I think that a lot of what determines how people interact with kids is about them. It's about individual characteristics and probably less so about degrees.
Any further questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michelle Perlman, for your time, for your presentation. We will be in touch. We will keep you informed of our work.
Great. Thank you. Good luck.
Thanks. Goodbye. Donc, messieurs, dames, ceci conclut notre audience publique d'experts. Je vous remercie de votre participation. Je vous rappelle que dans les prochains jours, nous serons en mesure de rendre public tous les mémoires sur le site Internet de la Commission. Donc, vous pouvez surveiller le site Internet. Et puis, de toute façon, vous ayant inscrit ici à l'entrée, vous êtes dans notre liste d'envoi. Donc, vous allez pouvoir suivre vraiment toutes les étapes de la Commission. Donc, à ceux qui nous écoutaient en ligne aussi, merci et au plaisir des prochaines étapes. Un mot de fin, pardon, j'oubliais.
Merci de votre fidélité, d'avoir été là, témoin de nos rencontres et de nos discussions. Alors, à ceux qui étaient en ligne aussi, merci.
Voilà, et je vous rappelle que la commission se déplace à Sept-Îles la semaine prochaine. Donc, nous serons à Sept-Îles mardi après-midi, rencontre avec les groupes et les organismes, et en soirée, le Forum citoyen. Si vous connaissez des gens à Sept-Îles, faites passer le message parce qu'il reste des places pour les forums citoyens en particulier. On aimerait pouvoir recruter davantage de participants, donc ça serait super utile. Et sinon, toutes les autres villes, là, les lieux, les dates sont affichés sur notre site Internet. Alors, merci beaucoup. Donc, la question était, est-ce que c'est complet la majorité des activités? Donc, il reste de la place dans tous les forums citoyens, parce que là, on a une grande capacité. Là, on peut en général accueillir jusqu'à 50 personnes en région, puis encore plus à Montréal et à Québec. Donc, c'est complet nulle part pour les forums citoyens. Par contre, pour les audiences des groupes et organismes, c'est complet dans les villes de Montréal, Québec. Sarah, est-ce que tu peux m'aider? On va retrouver l'information. Il y a 2 autres villes, en tout cas, que les audiences des groupes sont complets. OK. Donc, les groupes complets sont Gatineau, Jonquière, Québec et Montréal, seulement pour les sessions d'audience publique des groupes et organismes. Puis ça, c'est une activité un peu du même type que ce qu'on a vécu dans les 2 derniers jours, c'est-à-dire qu'on donne des périodes de 10 minutes de présentation suivies d'échanges avec les commissaires. Par contre, les forums citoyens qui se déroulent en soirée, c'est une toute autre formule d'activité. Il n'y a pas vraiment de préparation requise, outre peut-être prendre connaissance des questions de consultation, mais de toute façon, c'est vraiment une discussion encadrée, animée par l'INM. Les commissaires sont présents pour entendre. Donc, c'est ça, c'est une activité de discussion surtout et non une audience publique plus traditionnelle comme aujourd'hui. Donc, voilà, merci encore à tous et au plaisir de se retrouver. Au revoir.